Welcome back to another one of these discussions where we talk a little bit about how current events may be influencing research, but there are a couple of kind of, I don't know, ground rules about research, like what research is good for, that it might be helpful to understand before we continue in our discussion. So, what is research good for?
The answer is definitely not absolutely nothing.
I think that the average person on the street, to the extent that they know anything about research or science, how science is done, think that there's maybe some kind of societally useful value in the knowledge itself. But I think as educators, we are also concerned about educating students and using research as a vehicle for training.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, it's hard to say. I think you ask the average person on the street what research is good for, they're not going to be so interested in educating students unless they themselves were involved. The knowledge itself, I think that's another stretch for the average person. I think the way they see it is through all of this technology that they have, and may not realize that the iPhone in your pocket is a result of decades of research, of tons of PhDs, of all of this research that happens later on in the industry itself. And I think that might be where some of the disconnect comes from. You know, you get this device from Apple, you think, okay, Apple did this all themselves, and it comes from their technology, but there's so much more that happened before that.
I was talking to a friend, and I'll name drop here. This is Andy Ballister, who is the co-founder of GoFundMe, and he's kind of a serial entrepreneur, and he lives in San Diego with his family. And he was telling me one day that he doesn't think that he would find a life in academia satisfying because the people, your team is different every year. Like PhD students, undergraduates, postdocs, they come in and there's some churn, right? And the way that I sometimes think about it is that the knowledge, you fill people up with knowledge and then you put them on the conveyor belt and they go out into the world, right? Like the research generates knowledge, but it also generates trained individuals.
Right.
And there is some question as to whether you pick a project for its ability to train students as a vehicle to train students, or you pick the project to be useful in its own, like the knowledge produced by the project to be useful in its own right.
Mm-hmm.
I was at a talk by, name drop again, Grant Wilson, who is professor emeritus at UT Austin, but worked at the IBM Almaden Research Center in the Silicon Valley for many years, who co-invented, along with Jean Fauché, chemically amplified photoresist, which is sort of the basis of how integrated circuits are manufactured. And he is a very humble guy in many ways, and he said at this award ceremony at the American Chemical Society that I have used polymer chemistry as photoresists, so these materials that allow you to make integrated circuits, as primarily a vehicle to educate students. And I thought that was very magnanimous of him to say, because probably he's on the short list for the Nobel Prize for the importance of the invention. Then I posted something on, back then, Twitter, and I said, is the purpose of your research, like I made it a vote or something, is it because it's a vehicle for training, or because you believe in the research and its outcomes? And somebody responded quite vehemently and said that, like, I don't work on just, silly projects that students write a lab report about, right. and they're educated. I want to do something impactful. And are those two types of projects the same?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think there's all different kinds of projects. Ideally, you do both. You educate students, you train them in the skills that they need to succeed in the workforce and later in life, while learning more about fundamental principles that are important for enabling new technology. I think the goal is to do both, but it's not always clear how impactful the research is going to be from the outset. I think that can be really hard. I think if you talk to people who are working in like very, very fundamentals with quantum computing now, like that, it might be not as tangible how that's going to affect people later down the road. I think there's much more applied research, like in my lab doing catalysis, you can really see how that can have an impact, because what we're doing is a really small version of what's going to, or what could exist in a larger reactor down the road. I've seen examples of PhD projects elsewhere, not so much in my lab, maybe you've had some in your lab, where they're like directly funded by industry, so the project is really fully funded by industry. I think those projects, I don't know, I've seen them before. I find them perhaps less satisfying for the PhD student, because maybe you got into research with the goal of, I don't know, developing new technology that's really going to help society, help the environment, etc. And now you're doing a project working for Exxon, and I don't know, feels maybe like you sold out. But at the end of the day, the result, I think, on the student is going to be similar in that you've created new knowledge, you've developed new skills. So I think, I don't know, it's going to be hard. From the outside, it can be difficult to know what the impact of the research is going to be.
I was tempted to say that, well, why do we even have the expectation or the criterion of novelty on a research project to make it a PhD project? Why not? In principle, could you just have everyone do the same PhD project the way we make undergraduates all do the same lab report? And then the idea of creating knowledge by playing the game of going to the library and figuring out what exactly is going to be new is indeed a big chunk of it. I think that there are some projects that are too clear from the start. I'm going to put, sorry to single out a field, but I'm going to put like total synthesis in that category, where like once the molecule is done, you finish the PhD, and the student has a lot of say in experimental design day to day, but they don't necessarily get to get the experience of choosing what of project selection and scientific strategy, because the PI, let's say, puts the device or the algorithm on the board, the proverbial whiteboard or a slide, the first day or the first year of the PhD, and says, do this, and then in 5 years you'll get a PhD. Right. Shouldn't part of the exercise be figuring out where the holes in the literature are? And actually, I guess, is the literature even relevant in that particular area?
Yeah, it's a totally different kind of approach. I think that level of prescription is, I don't know, detrimental to our enterprise in some ways, because then that project is becoming so much more about the PI than educating the student, and it's not really about creating knowledge, because you sort of know where it's going to go. It's just, we're going to turn the crank and get this thing out, and the student's going to be this worker for me. And then I think you're blurring the lines a little bit between like a student who is gaining these skills and being educated versus someone just coming to your lab to do a service for you.
Mm-hmm. The third motivation for doing research, so we've got educating students, value of the knowledge itself, is commercialization and invention, or I guess in the other order, invention and commercialization. So every university has a technology transfer office, and the typical process is that somebody makes a discovery in a lab. Usually it's a device or compound or process or algorithm, and you disclose it to the technology transfer office. Here it's called UR Ventures, and they work with the inventors to figure out if this is worth going through the whole rigmarole of the patenting process. So you file a provisional. The provisional could, the strong version of a provisional requires a lawyer to draft. You get the provisional claims, and then after a year, you decide if you want to convert that provisional into a patent application, and that's patent application looks and smells like a full patent, but it's not granted, it's not awarded by the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office yet. Once you have some IP, and it can even be in provisional form, you have some options of what to do with it. One is to try to look for a licensee. This is a company that wants to use your idea. And then another is kind of the one that's a little bit more romantic, I think, is where a student or faculty member take up that idea and try to form a company based on it. And so I don't want to leave that off. I would say that is a relatively minor motivation amongst people in our position. There are some some PIs who consider what they do is kind of an incubation of ideas, and there are many labs. My former PhD supervisor formed several companies, like at least 12 companies. My old dean at UCSD, same kind of thing. Postdoc advisor, to a lesser extent, although she recently had a gigantic commercial success out of an invention, and so that's a thing, but I wouldn't say that the median, even engineering professor has that in mind.
Mm-hmm. I would agree that the average professor doesn't have that in mind, but I think that piece is necessary for the whole enterprise to exist, because I think if we were only educating students and creating fundamental knowledge, the impact on the economy would be so much less, and the impact on society would be so much less, that if what we were doing was just creating knowledge for the sake of creating knowledge and educating a relatively small number of students who go on to get PhDs, that there would be such little value added to society that I think it's a small aspect that most faculty want to get into, but it's a hugely important part that I think keeps the train running. So,
yeah, there's a needle I want to thread here where you can have an invention and not file IP.
mm-hmm.
So you can invent something and then just publish a paper on it and put it out there in the literature and allow people to use it. And there are a few different strategies, and I'm sure people who know more about IP and the history of academic inventions might be able to speak better about this than I can. But there's the idea that in one camp, if you invent something, you have to put protection around it, otherwise there's no value to the licensee. They won't have exclusivity, or even if it's a non-exclusive patent, there are 3 people acting on it, 3 people practicing the art, as opposed to one. It doesn't matter. You're limiting because you have to pay in order to use this invention, and as such, they get some amount of time to work on it, to show deliverables to the university, to show that the technology is actually in good hands and that the licensing agreement can proceed. And then hopefully they develop the product, they make a lot of money, and they improve people's lives and so on. Not necessarily in that order. The other camp says if you put something out there in the literature and it's totally say it even is patentable, but you decide not to do it for whatever reason. That's still out there, and the R&D departments of pharma companies, of materials companies, they all subscribe to the journals, and they are looking up how to do stuff in medicinal chemistry and process chemistry. They're looking up stuff in the literature all the time, and it may not be patented. Most of it is not, and yet they're still generating economic value from it. Now, it doesn't have the sexiness of a startup or a licensing play, but it's still very much an invention.
Yeah. Do you think, part of the challenge that we're in right now, where the average person doesn't understand what basic research is or the importance of it, is that companies do follow that roadmap where they take some fundamental research, apply it to what they're doing, and develop some product and make a lot of money. It's in everyone's pockets, or it's a consumer product that everybody uses, but they don't tangibly give any credit to those papers, to that fundamental research that went into their product, their technology. So just like academics, like we're obligated to cite literature that came before us, otherwise it's considered plagiarism. Like, should these companies be obligated to cite the freely available knowledge that went into their
I love
work?
that. I never thought of that.
I
It's
just
like,
thought of it.
or maybe we could do some kind of reverse citation and say, so I noticed, during the, I didn't notice, but my wife noticed that her grad school paper was cited in the key patent from Moderna, and so maybe in some small way her work influenced the thinking of one of the mRNA,
right?
And it became part of the base of this pyramid of knowledge that ultimately led to a vaccine. And what if we retroactively take credit? Like, why not, right? In our department, one of our emeritus faculty invented the organic light emitting device, which is in pretty much everyone's pocket. If you have an iPhone, it's been OLED displays for the last several models. But do people know that technology was invented by a U of R emeritus faculty member? Well, if you go on our website, you know that. And so, and it's, of course, you could go on the NSF website and see, the internet funded by basic science research, the biotechnology, recombinant DNA, all like materials research, energy research. Most of it was funded publicly at some fundamental level. And so it's almost so ubiquitous that it's boring.
Yeah.
But now you see, like, on the political right, you see, well, what good is the research anyway, because the life expectancy in America is going down, so why does it matter if you have a better cancer treatment? Like, I can't believe that discourse has actually gone in this direction, but if you spend as much time on social media as I did before I blocked most of it a couple months ago, that's the kind of stuff that you see. And so, but it's one of those things where it's not going to matter to people until you take away those products.
Yeah, I think this is such a hard problem that humans are intrinsically bad at. Like, anything where there's a slow, subtle effect that can take years to develop, where there's not a clear causality, can be really difficult for people to connect. So by the time I think we start seeing effects of if NSF is cut by 50%, it's going to be so far ahead, like it's going to take several years, that by then someone else or something else will get blamed, and it's going to be hard for the average person to understand that this is the result of NSF cuts. I think it's difficult to make those connections, but on the other hand, I think it's like scientists need to do more than just say, oh, we need this money, trust us, it's important for us to research these things because it will lead to X, Y, and Z. Like, I don't think we can 100% rely on past performance being an indicator of future success in the realm of misinformation. That we need stronger, more tangible arguments, and I think we have to constantly remind people what it is we do, why it's important, and what the tangible outcomes are.
Speaking of, okay, so the original kind of DOGE mandate was to search for waste, fraud, and abuse. Let's look at waste, fraud, and abuse. Is there wasteful research?
I mean,
you can just reflect it right back to me.
Yeah,
because I ambushed you with that.
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I mean, I think like if you looked around any lab and you did a DOGE-like audit, you'd probably find that money is being spent on things it shouldn't be spent on. The time is being wasted in some ways or another. I think if you zoom out more broadly and say, is this project wasteful? I mean, you might not even know at the outset. Like, there's instances of starting research on one project and then you find something else out that you didn't even intend to research in the first place. I mean, look at NSF awards, for example. You write a proposal on X. Did you do X to the letter? Maybe not. Probably not, because you found a direction that was more interesting, and that's how so much scientific discovery happens.
You also write a proposal and then you wait 1.5% of your life before you get the money, and then of course things have changed because a year is a long time. I think an observer from Mars would see the money going into academic STEM research labs and then see people coming out. Mm-hmm. And the one aspect of research that's misunderstood is that research funding is really training funding. Right. So there are training grants that supply funding for X number of PhD students or postdocs, but then even a regular kind of mainline grant is, most of those costs go to personnel. They go to grad student stipends and salaries, stuff that we mentioned the last time we got together. And then there are the publishers that take the money and do copy editing and promotion and organize peer review and so on. And that's a whole nother episode of how valuable it's valuable work. Maybe not. Maybe it shouldn't be quite so expensive as it is. Yeah.
Why are we paying them to publish the research that they didn't pay for?
Okay, we'll go there, right. Yeah, they get free editorial services, free content, and it's
not free. We're paying them.
And the whole enterprise is run at a negative cost because then the university that produced the research has to pay them to get access to it.
Right. That part too.
Okay, so anyway, we'll change that paradigm later, but one thing at a time. Okay, so is there wasteful research? I'm going to just come up with something really stupid here. Let's say that there is some research question that is not even like, okay, is it interesting, and what's the best possible outcome? Like, those are the questions that the guy who sat right behind me in grad school, Paul Brocker, editor of the ChemBark blog, where he would say, is it interesting, and what's the best possible outcome of the research? Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's come up with something that would be totally new and but would not have a particularly interesting outcome. Okay, let's say that I'm at my standing desk in that polypropylene carpet right below where I stand. Its coefficient of static friction changes by X percentage over the course of how many years, and what the mechanism in terms of what happens to the pill. Okay, so maybe
your chair running over it.
From my chair running over it, and no one is going to give a shit about the answer to that question.
I don't even think you're going to care.
I'm not even going to care. But you could, someone might care, mm-hmm. right? Someone might care. And there might be a project where you might be concerned about some similarly stupid problem that could be investigated using mm-hmm. engineering principles. But no one cares, even if you came with, and it's not even interesting.
Right. But what if this project that you're doing for the reason of understanding the coefficient of static friction of your carpet for, I don't know, you're doing it for who knows why, ends up informing much more important research, which has to do with like inhaling microplastic fibers from your carpet. And you might not be thinking about that application at the outset, but someone reads this paper in an unrelated field because they're doing background research on carpets and carpet fibers, and they find some interesting little bit of insight in your paper that ends up helping everyone, because when we vacuum and walk around, we no longer inhale tons of little carpet fibers anymore.
Do you think it's possible? That was good. I never would have thought of that. That is true. Okay, microplastics. Okay. Do you think if our objective was to learn about aerosolized microplastics, particularly blue-dyed polypropylene, isotactic polypropylene, do you think that the probability of my research project of leading to success in that particular field in public health would be as high as one that sought directly to find the sources of microplastic contamination in the air?
I have no idea.
I wonder if there is a way. So this was back in my younger days when I was really enjoyed atheist authors before I realized it was just a big circle jerk and we have more important things to care about. Where Richard Dawkins said, well, if there could be a God, there could not be a God. And the nice agnostic would say, well, the probability is 50-50. Mm-hmm. And Richard Dawkins said, no, it doesn't mean just because we don't know doesn't mean the probability is 50-50. He's not saying what the probability is, although I think he would say it was lopsided in one particular way that's idiosyncratic to Richard Dawkins. But let's say your goal was to uncover microplastic contaminant sources. Like, there could be a landscape of different probabilities, mm-hmm. starting with this starting point, this starting point, this starting point, and it doesn't mean that all the probabilities are equal. So I think a lot of the purest forms of scientific researchers, I'll say all of sciences and all of engineering, in research, engineering research is science, but anyway, another topic. That even the most pure form of those people would say you could start with pretty much any topic and you could get to something that was societally useful. Mm-hmm. But I don't know if that's a safe assumption. Society has an expectation because of tax dollars that it
Right.
doesn't even know what it's spending on?
Mm-hmm.
Is it elitist or anti-democratic for us to say, well, we know better, give us this, $300,000 a year, which is the, tax revenue from an entire, tract housing, suburban place, right? That every house in there, the taxes will all add up to this one research project.
Right.
And we don't even know if it's going to be good for anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that's where the peer review process is supposed to help out. Like, these proposals undergo such rigorous peer review and such a small fraction get funded that you would assume that your peers in the field are helping to make this judgment for you by deciding what is, that's part of the review criteria, right? The intellectual merit and the broader impacts, and those are weighted to different degrees, I guess, depending on the reviewer, but generally the intellectual merit gets most of the weight. So I think if you had two projects that had the same intellectual merit, you would expect that the one with the more tangible, broader impacts would be more likely to be funded, but broader impacts is a very broad term. Doesn't necessarily mean, is this going to benefit society with some invention? It's usually a lot more nuanced than that.
I'm going to be a jerk intentionally, but aren't the peer reviewers also people from the field of carpet friction? And
that's true. Yeah.
they may be biased.
That is very true. They might be really biased. So I don't know, maybe peer review needs to be more random. You have an expert from your field or two, and then you have a bunch of other people who are in different disciplines.
This is actually, I just thought of this, this is actually a big benefit of the way that center grant proposals are reviewed.
Mm-hmm.
So I used to think of centers as like a way for funding agencies to use up their budget with the minimum amount of administrative costs, because you can
Right.
get rid of $18 million in one shot,
Mm-hmm.
or you can give a whole bunch of like $300K grants and you do one
Right.
review process, although it's much more rigorous for a center grant, but
Mm-hmm.
proportionally it's way less of a commitment. But because a center proposal has many ideas in it, it's impossible to find one set of reviewers, because the carpet friction community will not be able to competently review the entire proposal.
Great.
So you have to scatter it. You have to scatter your reviewers in different disciplines, and maybe they come up with a more holistic outcome as
Mm-hmm.
it refers to the broader impacts.
Right.
I think that, and I'll play the side of the pro science person now. In NIH research, the first criterion that you have to hit is significance. So in NSF, it's intellectual merit and broader impacts. In NIH, there are 5 criteria. Now that I put myself in the spot, I hope I can get them all. Significance, innovation, approach, investigators, and environment. And then you give all 5 criteria scores. And then in your own mental weighting, you give it a score, an overall impact score, 1 through 9. And then it's like golf, the lower the score, the better, and you multiply it by 10 for some reason so that you don't get a decimal, and then that's the score that you get. And then there's a line, and then everything below that line gets funded, and then with maybe some wiggle room at the interface. And so NIH is much more applied, and this is also something that I didn't understand until much later in life that I'm prepared to admit, but NIH is the National Institutes of Health, so it's health research, not biology research, although there is necessarily some biology that happens in health. There has to be a health outcome in the science, otherwise it doesn't qualify as health research, and that may seem obvious to maybe everyone besides me, but it really solidified my grant-making strategy between NIH and kind of the more biological or behavioral parts of NSF or DoD funding opportunities. Anyway, so the significance, broader impacts is kind of baked into the way that we do most of the peer review.
Right.
Is there, okay, so that's waste. I don't have fraud in our notes. Should we do fraud? One thing, a high-profile solid-state physics thing that I was not connected to because it was before I became a professional scientist, but in the area of single molecule field effect transistors and the Bell Labs fiasco, and I ended up being quite close to some of the not major players in that fraud because they weren't they were cleared ultimately of wrongdoing, but Federico Capasso, John Rogers, Shannon Bao, who were at Bell Labs at the time and worked in various degrees with Jan Hendrik Schoen, who came up with had something like 15 papers retracted on. It was a bunch of different ideas. The SAMFET, self-assembled monolayer field effect transistor. There was like superconductivity in. It's always superconductivity. It's always in organic solids and crystalline organic solids, and it was a huge scandal. It was subject of a book, Plastic Fantastic, and one thing that has always been a concern, the biggest when fraud happens, who are the losers? The losers are the taxpayers, in the physical sciences, because biological sciences and the health research, there are significantly worse potential outcomes.
Like Elizabeth Holmes.
Or it would be, and that's only halfway to as bad as it could be, because that's a diagnostic. If if there was fraudulent research that pervaded a clinical trial in a therapeutic where you're injecting stuff into somebody instead of just extracting them, and maybe you give them bad medical advice, then it's way worse. But in physical sciences, the taxpayers are out money, which sucks. A lot of people are wasting their time in the primes of their academic lives. The institution suffers a reputational hit. Science itself suffers. But in the end, if you try to put some new material in a device at Samsung or Apple and it doesn't work, people are going to find that out, right?
Batteries start exploding?
Yes.
Because they built the separator too thin?
was that intentional, or was that just shoddy
I'm not
work?
sure. You'd have to ask Wyatt, but they made the separator too thin, so these batteries kept shorting and overheating.
I feel like the probability of deleterious adverse outcomes, to use the language of clinical trials, the probability of adverse outcomes is not equal from one field to another. If you take, I guess an area that is been under the microscope a lot is in sociological research, but you could get a really bad policy prescription, some bill could pass Congress, if Congress ever gets to passing bills again, based on some bad, some fraudulent research. Maybe it's not fraudulent, maybe it's just not reproducible, because the adequate controls weren't in place.
I completely agree that the magnitude of the damages and long-term effect is really going to be discipline dependent. I think that in the shorter term, the people who really suffer the most, I mean, again, it can be really discipline dependent. If we're talking about like strictly academic research before it's commercialized, we're going to be the students, because like the PI, if they're directing this fraud, like they're going to take the hit for it and they're going to suffer as they should. But the students like may not really understand what's going on, or may be trying to stop this in some way or another by reporting the actual findings like a doctor, who knows. But yeah, if they're tied to this person who's now famous for making up findings or doing X, Y, and Z that were wrong, like their careers are forever tainted. It's going to be really hard for them to explain to their next employer, like, what was your role in this? Like, how did you try to prevent it? Like, were you really just a bystander who unknowingly was participating in this? I mean,
Yeah.
you're going to be on like a criminal trial for your next position when all you were trying to do is just get educated and do some research.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue into the abuse category, where, you know, if there's abuse in the Doge sense of the word, they're not talking about abuse in the same, I think they're talking about like abuse of funds.
Mm-hmm.
But there is abuse in scientific research. I think that in the most benign of cases, it's negligent or unintentional, where there are scientists who get jobs as basically managers of little scientific fiefs or little startup companies in a department, and they don't have any human relations experience. They don't have any managerial experience. In some disciplines, they may never have even TA'd a class.
Right.
And then you give them a budget and some people's futures, some young, impressionable graduate students' futures, and they blow it. And the students have a really bad experience. The expectations are not clear. Most of the abusive cases that I've seen are not the PI abusing the student. I'm not going to say most. Okay, half. When I was associate dean for students in my last job at UC San Diego, when people would come to my office, half the time they were talking about, I'm not going to say half, less, 30 to 70%, I'm not sure what direction it was, but it's significant on both sides, is the PI having unreasonable expectations or verbally abusive or saying they need to work 80 hours a week or whatever it is. But the other times it's the lab culture, it's the people, the other people in the lab, the postdocs or graduate students or sometimes undergraduates who bully each other, but it may also be a case where the PI has not done enough to create a culture of trust and openness in the lab, or has hired some bad apples who screw it up for everybody. And so I think that one of the, particularly nefarious forms of abuse is when the PI's kind of personal ambition or unethical behavior sabotages the career of someone. And how are you going to know, right? Like if at the time you are searching for a PI in graduate school, you don't necessarily know that this person is going to commit fraud and your career is put in serious jeopardy. So what's a fix? Like, how do you avoid the worst possible?
I mean, I don't know. I tell this to my students. So I just had 3 undergrads graduate. We're all going to grad school. 2 of them are going to PhD programs. and they both asked me for advice about starting in their new institution. And the advice I gave them is to take the PhD advisor selection process very, very seriously. And so I remember from my experience when I was going through that, really taking the time to read up on recent papers and understand what faculty are doing right now, because like websites are infrequently updated. You can't really get a sense of it there. And it's a really important decision because you're tying yourself to this person for the next, not just the next 5 years, but for probably your next job too, and even longer if you're going into academia. And you can't just treat this like a game where you go into potential future advisor's office, sit down and say, hey, so tell me about your research. Do you have any questions? Oh, no, not really. I'll see you later. And then just write down 3 names and hope for the best of where you end up. I think it's such an important decision because you're not just kind of picking your boss for the next 5 or so years. You're tying your career to this person. And so I think the best thing to do is just be as rigorous as you possibly can. Like read up on their previous papers, read them carefully and critically, and go in with questions at the ready to really show that you have a sense of what they're doing. And then I think you can gauge a lot on how they respond. Like, are they getting defensive? You ask like inquisitive, difficult questions, or did they say, oh, we actually really don't know about that, it's something we're looking into now, or that's a great point, like it's something maybe we missed in this paper. I think that can give you a lot of insight to really, like, those meetings with future advisors are two-way interviews. And I think it's really important to approach them as such.
I think in addition to all of Marc's points, you also want to figure out what the student outcomes were,
Absolutely.
and if they got jobs in science or engineering, if they what the attrition rate was like. So what is the morbidity associated with this advisor? How many left under who left with a master's who didn't intend on getting a master's? If people tended to get the jobs that they wanted out of it. And then for the students who are in the lab now, are they happy about the decision? Most of them will tell you yes. My graduate student mentor in graduate school was probably the 1% of people who told me that he was not happy with his decision to join the group, and then I joined the group anyway. But you want to see if they're healthy, like literally, like are they emotionally healthy? Are they do they have lives? I mean, you want to work hard, of course. There's a reason why PhDs get a salary premium, because the PhD is more work than a full-time job. Right. Don't tell anyone I said that. But that's kind of the point, right? Yeah. Okay, there's one more category of waste, fraud, and abuse that we wanted to bring up. Or maybe...
summer salary.
Yes. What is summer salary?
It's when money from grants goes directly into faculty's bank accounts.
or so it goes on certain libertarian X accounts.
Yeah. But really, summer salary is faculty are paid 9 months out of the year for the 9 months that we're teaching, but that 9 months of salary gets divided over 12 months, so you get a paycheck every month. And so it's not that the summer comes and you just don't get paid. So effectively, like, if you're not doing research, you're not getting paid over the summer for the work that you're doing. So summer salary is funding from grants that goes to pay part of a faculty member's salary while they are working to account for the work that they're doing toward that particular project. So if you aren't taking summer salary on a grant, in some ways it's like a red flag, because the funding agency then says, well, are you actually going to commit any of your time to working on this project that you said you're going to work on?
I have a difficult relationship with summer salary. I think that universities make it really hard to distinguish what is your money and what's the university's money. So when you start a job or you move jobs, you get a startup package because it's assumed that you don't have any grants in your new job. Right. And so that can be a few $100,000 to over $1 million, depending on career stage. And you're usually allowed to spend up to, this is the same at UC San Diego and the same at Rochester, you could spend 4 months worth of salary on yourself. So, July and August your first year, and July and August your second year. But you could have put that money into research. You could have used that money to hire a postdoc, or to buy chemicals, or to spend money at the clean room or the animal use facility. And if you don't take it, and you spend it on research, it's kind of like giving your lab a gift. It works like a gift because you don't pay taxes on it. It's not considered income. You don't get any credit, like you don't get any feel-good credit. You don't get on the high donor list from your university, even though it's a lot of money if you don't take it. Right. Like a mid-career person, they might make $15,000 a month or something, and then you're giving the lab you're giving the university $30,000. And so they kind of dangle it in front of you. And then NSF, because the values of the grants are not that high, if you advance a certain point in your career, in your salary, you hit all the minimums, and of course, you hit the what's required to get the cost of living adjustment. The cost of living goes up, but the NSF grant is still $300,000, which has not caught up with inflation or cost of living. And so it costs a lot of money to pay yourself out of a grant that could have gone into the lab. And so you end up with these kind of silly budget spreadsheets where you put 0.25 months, and it's that's totally disingenuous. One, because why would my effort go down because my base salary has gone up? And also, am I really only going to work on this project for 1 week out of the year? No, that's absurd.
It's an interesting problem. I haven't thought about it that way, where you're making more money, but then you have to put less effort as you get paid more. But yeah, typically when I do grant budgets, if we need more room, the first thing that we cut is summer salary.
Yeah, because it's expensive.
Yeah, it's expensive, and at the end of the day, we want to make sure the students are getting paid for the work that we're doing, and that we have the materials and supplies that we need to do the work. And I think if you ask, probably not all, but most faculty, they will agree, because depending on the faculty, maybe they have different situations. They have a lot of kids, they have to save for college, etc. The summer salary is going to be worth different amounts to different people. But for me personally, and many of the faculty who I've worked with on putting grants together, that's the first thing we say. We have to cut. We need to make room in this grant. Where are we going to cut? Let's cut summer salary.
There's an entropy argument where there's a lot more ways for you to not get money for your lab than there is to get money. And so when you come up to the end of a grant period and you've overspent your supplies budget, where do you take the money from? Well, summer salary, right? Okay, I'm just not gonna get paid. But people say boo-hoo. And I think when this they say, boo-hoo, these rich professors who are doing what they love to do, and so they don't get paid in a month where they're getting a paycheck anyway, so they don't get that extra like bonus from the summer salary. No one feels bad for us, and maybe they shouldn't. But it's not like, is summer salary a good or bad thing? It's it's kind of the weird incentives that it produces, because faculty love the summer salary in general. They want to have the option to have it in there for whatever reason, whether they're going to use it as the piggy bank for unexpected costs in the proposal, or if everything is on, they'll use it for their kids' savings account or whatever, because it's a windfall in a month where you get summer salary. But then, why can't we be honest about this in grant review processes? If you don't have summer salary written in there, like your 1 week of the year at least, then the people on the panel will viciously attack you, because as the professoriate has to retain the ability to write summer salary.
Yeah, but it's like the most ridiculous thing, because everyone knows, like, if you get funded, you're going to put in the effort that you need to put in to do the work, and it really doesn't matter what that number says under summer salary.
It's also true that you could be an enormously productive researcher. Like we had a colleague at UC San Diego, Vlado Lubarda, and there are many people like him. He published 10 papers a year, but he was an instructional track faculty member. He did all kinds of scholarship in his office and on a computer, and published in good journals. And he was working all summer, but he didn't have a grant. And so
he wasn't getting paid
nominal,
for any of that work.
And granted, he wasn't doing work for the government, which is kind of the way that the granting system works, where the government is in a way the customer of the research apparatus of a university, because it pays us to do this work, which is also kind of weird, because we're the one that proposed that we do the projects, and they say, okay, there aren't that many other customers that will do that, so it's not a great analogy either. So I think we'll have to end it in a state of confusion. Anything you want to add?
No, I think that sums it up pretty well.
So, if you made it all the way to the end of the conversation, you can find more of me on Molecular Podcasting and the YouTube channel, which is just my name, Darren Lapomi. And
you can find me on PodCAT. And,
All right.
Great. Thanks for listening.